Congressman Representative Hank Johnson from Georgia is drafting legislation to limit a Pentagon program that provides surplus military equipment to local law enforcement. He has co-authored an op-ed which leads off by saying America is finally waking up to the militarization of its police forces. This is a good thing and heralds a tipping point in the changing face of policing in the United States. The co-author of that op-ed, which is Michael Shank, and Michael Shank is with us. Dr. Shank is Associate Director for Legislative Affairs at the Friends Committee on National Legislation, adjunct faculty at George Washington University's School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution, and tweets at Michael_Shank. Dr. Shank, thanks for being here this morning.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
All right, tell us, what kinds of equipment is it that this legislation could or should include?
Right. So this legislation would prohibit things like tanks, Humvees, mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicles, which are of the same size as an armored personnel carrier, assault weapons, armored drones, helicopters, grenade launchers. It would not prohibit things like office equipment coming back from the war zone or microwaves, stuff that might be of use to police. We certainly support that transfer.
Communications, like radios, because of frequencies, interoperability, and so on.
That's right.
What's the problem with Humvees?
Well, we think the main streets in America should remain demilitarized. We also think police forces are going to be more effective engaging their community. We're doing a lot of work with Norm Stamper, former Seattle police chief, who thinks the same, and others who believe in community-oriented policing. We think once you put a tank or a Humvee or an MRAP on a street, it puts immediately in an antagonistic position the police and the relationship with the community, and puts the community in a defensive position. It only escalates the situation, doesn't help with de-escalation around crowd control, that kind of thing.
Why did they start getting this equipment in the first place?
Right. So in 1997, Congress wrote into the National Defense Authorization Act this line item in U.S. Code, and it was called the 1033 program. The idea, in theory, makes sense. You've got surplus equipment. Let's bring it back. Let's give it to police. We think that's problematic for the reasons we mentioned. But you can also get military equipment through the Department of Homeland Security's Terrorism Grants Program, which has given $34 billion since 2001 to police to buy this kind of equipment. So 1033 is not the only one culpable for militarization of Ferguson or any other town. DHS is also.
Is this equipment something that is available to National Guard on a regular basis? Is this equipment that is, it's obviously separate from them, but is it something that they have at their beck and call if they need it, for example, in Missouri when Governor Jay Nixon called in the National Guard?
Right. So there was a story in National Journal this week about where Ferguson's military equipment came from. Some of it was 1033, some of it was DHS, and some of it was National Guard. So in terms of accountability of where this equipment was acquired, there's very little, which has allowed for waste, fraud, and abuse. We're seeing a lot of county sheriffs and police chiefs get assault weapons and then give them away to friends, sell them on eBay. All of this is documented in terms of this kind of waste, fraud, and abuse. There's just very little accounting, no in-person inspection of this equipment, no needs assessment. So police force without a body of water. There's a small town in Georgia that got a bunch of boats and scuba gear. So there's very little kind of needs assessment and then accountability, oversight, monitoring once they get that equipment.
Once again, we're speaking with Dr. Michael Shank as we're discussing the militarization of the American police force. People, I think, probably know what an MRAP is, mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicle. That sounds like a very defensive kind of a vehicle. What's the problem with police having something like that?
Well, take that and couple it with another stat that came out. Washington Post did a nice story on, well, it's a devastating story, on 3/4 of American cities, 50,000 or more, have white majority police forces patrolling minority communities. So you take a community like that where the minority community doesn't feel represented by the police come in with an MRAP, and you've taken what would have otherwise been a civil situation and ramped up and escalated the tension tenfold. So we see any kind of militarization being problematic in terms of community liaising or any kind of representation by the community or of the community in the police force. And it's taking what should be a civilian conversation and making it a military conversation.
So should this only be in areas, should this restriction occur only in places where you have a majority white police force in a black community?
No, we think this should be a national implementation, which is why we're pushing this legislation and why we've got bipartisan interest in the House and why the Senate, Senator McCaskill, is going to have a hearing in September in Homeland Security Committee and Government Oversight about the same topic, and we expect it to be bipartisan. Senator Paul's weighed in Time Magazine, as you know. No, we think it should be everywhere prohibited in terms of this transfer of equipment. Also, something to talk about is taxpayer funding the bill. Once you get Tupelo, Mississippi, for example, got a helicopter, and it immediately needed $100,000 in upgrades and then annual repairs of $20,000. That cost is going to be borne by the taxpayer. So these are MRAPs are $700,000, $800,000, and they get them free. The taxpayer has to pay for delivery, but then the maintenance costs on those MRAPs will run $20,000 to $40,000 a year.
Now, is this a combat helicopter you're discussing, or is this a helicopter that could be used, for example, for emergency evacuation and so on?
Combat. We are fine with benign uses of unarmored drones and helicopters that are used for surveillance, but we have problems in the legislation specifically cites armored drones and helicopters that would be combat.
So bottom line, though, there are some budgetary concerns, but basically this is an image problem. This is, in other words, the optics, if for want of a better word, of having military-style vehicles in a situation you believe will probably inflame as opposed to help quell the situation.
Well, especially with a lot of the police forces don't have training for this, and again, there's no needs assessment, so they're getting a piece of equipment. They've had no training, and I've talked with several police chiefs over the past year who have had no crowd control training in the last 30 years of their service. So not only is there no crowd control training, there's no training in terms of using an MRAP, so you get it. And already, yes, there's a perception issue, but it could be misused pretty quickly.
How often is this equipment used? That's another question, because it seems to me that the times when this kind of crowd control requiring this equipment or even calling for the possible use of this equipment would be fairly rare.
Yeah, well, I think what's going to happen is that it will be used inadvertently or unintentionally. I think the police
or just to show that we've got it. It's like TV stations doing live stand-up shots with their satellite trucks when they first got them because they put them in front of the station just to prove that they had live satellite capability.
Yep, and domestic might mirror foreign policy in the sense that this shock and awe approach, kind of what we did in Iraq, I think police forces might think that might work here as well. If you just bring out the full force, people will be intimidated and stand down, and that's actually not happening.
And as you said, there are going to be hearings on the Hill on this, correct?
Yep, on the Senate and House side.
All right. We'll look forward to listening to those. I appreciate your spending time with us, Dr. Shank. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Dr. Michael Shank, full title, Associate Director for Legislative Affairs at the Friends Committee on National Legislation, adjunct faculty at George Mason University School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution. We will link you to the op-ed that he co-authored with Representative Hank Johnson, Stop Treating America Like a War Zone. And we will also note that he tweets at Michael_Shank.